Welcome to the next installment in a series of guides for Final Fantasy XVI. In today's video, we'll be covering the icon Shiva, specifically how each of their iconic abilities work and how to use them effectively during combat. If you're interested in more guides and content for Final Fantasy XVI, then definitely subscribe as there's more on the way. Alternatively, if you're looking for a combat guide that will take you through the basics, I have a video that has that topic covered as well. So without further ado, let's dive right in. As soon as I had pretty much unlocked Shiva in my initial playthrough of Final Fantasy XVI, they became a mainstay in my icon loadout, a permanent addition, going well beyond the endgame and into New Game Plus as well, primarily because of the utility of their iconic feat, Cold Snap, which we'll get onto in just a second, and the fact that a lot of their iconic abilities hit multiple enemies and do a plethora of stagger damage. So first things first, the initial topic that I want to cover is their iconic feat, titled Cold Snap. Whenever you have Shiva junctioned as the main icon, pressing the circle button, the Cold Snap button, allows Clive to perform a dodge that covers a substantial distance both on the ground and mid-air, making it a lot more versatile than his original dodge, which ends up covering not that much distance at all. Final Fantasy XVI has a lot of boss fights, both on New Game and New Game Plus, that feature bosses that have large area of effect attacks that sometimes feel almost impossible to dodge entirely or get out of the way of if you're not already on the perimeter of the area of effect. Using Shiva's Cold Snap ability entirely alleviates the risk of getting hit by these area of effect attacks, particularly those that can one-shot you in New Game Plus if you're not careful. The utility of Cold Snap doesn't just stop there either. There are two sub-abilities, so to speak, that are tied to Cold Snap that make it that much more worthwhile. The first of which is Frostbite. Whenever you perform a Cold Snap dodge, regardless of whether or not you're evading an enemy attack or not, you're able to press the circle button once more during the dodge animation, upon which Clive will throw out a floating orb of ice that will freeze enemies temporarily on contact. This Frostbite sub-ability is great for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that it allows you to set up some pretty cool looking combos if you know what you're doing, but it can also freeze enemies, even including during their attack animation, which can give you the reprieve or a breather that you need to help reevaluate and assess the flow of battle. Whether that's evaluating what icon you want to use next or what abilities you have available that are on cooldown, or even just simply using items. The only thing to keep in mind with Frostbite is that Clive typically tends to throw out this floating orb at the end of his dodge, so you'll have to space out this move correctly if you want to freeze enemies. The second sub-ability that's tied to Cold Snap is titled Permafrost, and in my opinion, this just so happens to be one of the most overpowered abilities that Clive has at his disposal. By using Cold Snap to dodge an enemy's attack at the very last second, similar to how a precision dodge works, Clive actually freezes a large portion of the battlefield, leaving them defenseless for a substantial amount of time. The duration of time that enemies are frozen largely depends on the strength of the attack that you manage to evade at the last second. With the stronger or potentially more deadly the attack, the longer an enemy is frozen. You could argue that it isn't necessarily an overpowered ability, considering the large gambit requires you to take a massive risk to be able to pull it off successfully, which is why you could make the argument that this isn't overpowered and is quite balanced. Regardless, Permafrost is incredibly effective against mini-bosses and bosses, as even though the enemies are frozen, you'll still be able to deteriorate their stagger bar with all of the attacks you have at your disposal. The only warning or thing that you should be aware of when using Cold Snap, specifically with Frostbite, is that if you freeze an enemy mid-attack animation, once they become unfrozen, that attack animation will continue, and so if you're standing in front of them when they begin to thaw out, you will get hit with that attack. With Cold Snap out of the way, let's start discussing some of Shiva's iconic abilities. First up is the ability titled Ice Age. Ice Age is a chargeable move where, when let go, Clive will unleash a torrent of glaciers that surf across the surface towards an enemy, throwing them back with great strength and actually launching them. Like a lot of the chargeable moves in Final Fantasy XVI, there is a sweet spot to the charge of Ice Age, where if you let go of the button in the red portion of the gauge, which is the precision window, Ice Age will be modified slightly to reward the player for getting the correct timing, upon which the width of the attack will be increased, there'll be a greater knockback effect, and the enemy will actually be frozen and suspended in midair after the attack animation is over and done with. You can hit multiple enemies with this move, it is wide enough to do so, and it's also worth mentioning that it does more physical damage than it does stagger damage, and as such, it should be used on enemies who are already staggered, as opposed to ones who still have the will to fight. Moving on, the next ability I want to cover is called Mesmerize. When Mesmerize is used in its base unupgraded form, Clive will throw out 3 shards of ice that will quickly explode, that have the capability of pulling in lighter enemies back towards Clive, allowing him to continue on with an unrelenting flurry of blows. When upgraded, Clive will throw an additional 3 shards of ice behind him, allowing him to pull in enemies from all types of directions. This move can also be used in midair, albeit he won't pull enemies up towards him in midair, he'll just pull them underneath him instead, setting them up for a perfect down thrust. And as expected, if an enemy is too heavy to be launched, then they'll be too heavy to be pulled in with the Mesmerize move, so keep that in mind when facing off against your foes. Continuing to work our way down the list of abilities, up next is Rhyme. Interestingly enough, this move doesn't have Clive spitting bars over an instrumental. Instead, it has Clive throw out a giant spinning snowflake that damages any enemy that comes into contact with it. If an enemy is light enough, they'll actually be pulled in by the snowflake's vacuum effect, which will keep them drawn in, continuously being damaged. It's important to note that you can also use Rhyme in midair to keep enemies suspended, and should an enemy move out of its range, perhaps they dodged before or after you used it, or they're simply too heavy to be pulled in by its vacuum effect, you can re-execute Rhyme and move it to a different location by simply pressing the button again to summon it once more. The last and final iconic ability that I want to talk about is Shiva's ultimate move, Diamond Dust. Out of all of the iconic abilities that Clive has at his disposal throughout all of his icons, Diamond Dust provides the most stagger damage out of all of his abilities. When employing the use of Diamond Dust, time will slow to a crawl, like with most other ultimate icon abilities out there, upon which Clive will send out a massive shockwave of ice, or 2 shockwaves if you've got it upgraded, in a 360-degree area of effect around Clive that can launch lighter enemies, and will do a substantial amount of stagger damage. Diamond Dust is one of those abilities for me that has a permanent place in my icon loadout, specifically because of how effective it is against mini-bosses and bosses. And of course, when paired with Ramuh's Lightning Rod ability, you will literally melt enemies' stagger bar. It is that powerful. I also quickly want to mention that Diamond Dust does have a lot of invincibility frames in its startup animation, which will allow you to simply phase through incoming enemy attacks if you execute it with the right timing. And with that, we come to the end of the Shiva guide. If you found this video helpful or enjoyable, leave a like and subscribe, as there's more guides on the way. If you feel there's anything that I didn't mention, let me know down in the comments below. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank you all for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.